The midday sun blazed across the polished courtyard of the private airport, every corner shining with wealth and power. A luxurious white jet stood ready inside the hangar, its silver edges glinting like a jewel under the light. Around it, men in expensive suits and women in crisp uniforms moved with confidence, their polished shoes clicking in perfect rhythm on the smooth concrete floor. Every detail in the scene screamed of privilege, the kind of world where money speaks louder than respect. And then, silence fell for a brief moment. Heads turned. A figure had stepped into their perfect little world. A figure who seemed as though he belonged to an entirely different reality. He was thin, his skin darkened by years beneath the sun. His cheeks were hollow yet proud, his hands rough, calloused from a lifetime of hard work. His shirt was patched and stained, his trousers worn thin at the knees, and his old straw hat bent at the edges as if it had seen countless summers. A weathered leather bag dangled from his shoulder, carrying nothing more than simplicity. The contrast was striking. In a place where suits cost more than villages, here stood a man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a dusty field. The executives and staff exchanged glances, whispers rippling through the air. A smirk curled on one man's lips. Another elbowed his colleague, stifling a laugh. "Where did he come from?" Someone muttered. "Must have taken the wrong turn." Another chuckled. The sound of mocking laughter echoed faintly against the steel walls of the hangar. The old man kept walking slowly forward, each step measured, steady, unshaken. His presence disturbed them, not because of who he was, but because of how little he seemed to care about how out of place he appeared. To them, he was invisible. A joke, a mistake standing in a world of power. But what they didn't know was that this man was about to shatter every illusion they carried. He wasn't here by accident. He wasn't lost, and the laughter they carried so proudly would soon turn into silence they would never forget. The old farmer's footsteps echoed softly across the hangar floor, so different from the confident, hurried strides of the executives. He didn't rush, didn't look left or right, only moved forward with the same patience that had carried him through decades of hard labor. But for those around him, his very presence was something to mock, a performance staged for their amusement. A young executive in a tailored navy suit leaned toward his colleague, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by others. "What is he doing here? Did someone leave the back gate open for the laborers?" Laughter followed. Another added with a snicker, "Careful, or he might try to sell us potatoes in this hangar." The group chuckled openly now, their polished watches glinting as they folded their arms and watched the old man with smirks. They didn't lower their voices anymore. Their insults rolled off their tongues like cheap entertainment. One of the airline staff whispered behind her hand, "Look at those clothes. He must have picked them from a donation bin." Another stifled a giggle, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe such a man had wandered into this space of luxury. The old farmer, Rugav Sharma, heard every word. His ears had grown sharp through years of being underestimated, of listening to traders dismiss him and bankers mock his appearance. Yet he gave no reply. His gaze was steady on the floor ahead, his wrinkled face calm as still water. This silence unsettled them. They expected anger, embarrassment, or at least an explanation. But Rugav offered none. His patience was not weakness. It was the strength of a man who had been tested far more brutally than the shallow ridicule of the rich. Then came the cruelest of all. A man in his early 40s, confident and sharp-tongued, broke from the group. His name was Difier Malhotra, a manager known for chasing wealthy clients and boasting about his connections. His shoes clicked loudly as he stepped forward, blocking Rugav's path. With a mocking smile, Difier pointed a finger at Rugav's chest. "Old man," he said with false politeness, loud enough for all to hear, "this is a private facility. You don't belong here. Did you get lost on your way to the fields?" The laughter that followed was harsher now, fueled by Difier's arrogance. A few clapped lightly, as though it was a comedy act staged for their entertainment. Someone muttered, "He probably came here hoping to see how the rich fly." And another added, "Maybe he thought there was free food here." For a moment, the hangar was filled with the sound of polished voices mocking a man whose only fault was his simple appearance. Rugav lifted his eyes. His gaze met Difier's, calm and unwavering. Those eyes were not the eyes of a beggar or a lost farmer. They were the eyes of a man who had seen droughts destroy harvests, floods sweep away crops, and debts hang like nooses over his family. They were the eyes of survival, of grit that no luxury could ever understand. But still, Rugov did not speak. His silence carried more weight than 1,000 words. Diffier shifted uncomfortably under the stare, but quickly covered it with another smirk. Well, say something, or have the years in the sun dried up your tongue as well as your clothes? More laughter. The group was enjoying themselves at his expense. Yet in that very laughter lay their greatest mistake, for they believed they were mocking weakness. What they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that they were mocking power greater than their own. Every insult, every smirk, every cruel word only deepened the silence around Rugov, and in that silence was the storm waiting to break. The hangar echoed with laughter, but within Rugov Sharma there was silence, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of patience, of storms weathered, of a man who had lived long enough to know that pride built on mockery always collapses on its own. His wrinkled face remained calm, his eyes lowered yet steady. Those who stood before him saw only an old farmer too poor to buy a ticket, too lost to know his place. But behind those eyes lived memories that none of them could have borne for a single season. As Diffier Malhotra's finger pressed against his chest, Rugov remembered a different time, a time when survival itself was a battle. He remembered his youth, standing barefoot in cracked fields under a sun so merciless it seemed determined to turn the soil into stone. His hands, blistered and bleeding, clawed at the earth day after day, praying for rain that never came. He remembered the taste of hunger when food was scarce, the sound of his wife's voice sewing patches onto his shirt by the dim light of a lantern, whispering encouragement even as her own stomach growled with emptiness. He remembered his children walking miles to school with torn sandals, their tiny feet bleeding yet their spirits unbroken. Every insult he heard today was a mere echo of the insults he had heard for decades. At banks, clerks had looked at his torn clothes and dismissed him without listening. At markets, traders had mocked him, calling him a dreamer when he offered them crops from lands they had long abandoned as worthless. Neighbors had laughed when he bought barren plots of land with borrowed money, shaking their heads at his foolishness. "Nothing will ever grow there," they said. "Your children will starve before those fields ever feed you." But Rugov had not listened to the voices of doubt. He had listened to the earth. He had worked the barren soil with patience, coaxing life where others saw only death. Season after season, year after year, he gave everything and sweat, blood, hope, until green shoots pierced the dry ground. Where others saw dust, Rugov saw harvests. Where others abandoned, Rugov reclaimed. Slowly, piece by piece, his vision grew into reality. One barren field became two. Two became 10. Valleys that had been forgotten bloomed again with crops. Hillsides turned golden with wheat, green with vegetables, rich with fruits. What others had called impossible, Rugov turned into abundance. And with every harvest, his strength grew, not only in wealth but in dignity. He sold not just to his village, not just to his state, but across borders, across oceans. His grains fed nations. His fruits reached foreign markets. Quietly, without ever changing his patched clothes or simple sandals, Rugov Sharma became one of the wealthiest men in the country. Yet, wealth had never changed him. He still rose before dawn to walk his fields. He still bent his knees in prayer, thanking the soil for its gifts. He still gave freely, food to the hungry, money to build schools where children had no books, water wells in villages where mothers walked miles with empty pots. Standing now in that hangar, mocked for his hat and his shirt, Rugov felt no anger. How could he? These men had never seen the pain of hunger. They had never bent their backs until they broke, only to stand again because giving up meant death. They had never gambled everything on a barren patch of land and won through sheer willpower. They laughed at his clothes, but his clothes carried stories richer than their suits could ever tell. Diffier sneered again, mistaking Rugov's silence for shame. The executives chuckled, mistaking his patience for weakness. But what none of them knew was that their laughter was aimed at a man who could buy every suit in that hangar 100 times over. A man whose quiet empire stretched further than their narrow imaginations. Rugov finally lifted his eyes again. He did not speak, but his gaze carried decades of storms, droughts, struggles, and victories. It was a gaze that said, "I have walked through fires you cannot endure. I have stood against winds that would have broken you, and yet here I stand, and calm, unshaken." The silence grew heavy. Even the laughter began to falter for a moment. for something in his presence didn't match the picture they had painted of a helpless old farmer. Something about him was different. Too steady, too unbothered, too strong. But arrogance is blind. They didn't stop mocking. Not yet. And so Rugov remained still, waiting, patient as always. For he knew that truth, like crops, blooms at its own time. And when it blooms, no one can deny its power. As laughter echoed in the hangar, the truth of Rugov Sharma's life lay hidden beneath the folds of his tattered shirt and the dust on his sandals. They saw only an old farmer, out of place among jets and million-dollar suits. What they didn't see was the story of a man who had built an empire quietly, brick by brick, crop by crop, without ever seeking the world's applause. To understand Rugov, one had to leave the sterile shine of that airport hangar and step into the fields at dawn, for it was there, in the misty silence of early mornings, that his true kingdom breathed. When the sun rose, it rose over valleys that bore his name, lands once considered barren, now flourishing with crops that stretched as far as the eye could see. Vast fields of golden wheat swayed like oceans, orchards burst with mangoes and oranges, hillsides glowed with vegetables and tea plantations. Villages thrived because of his investments. Markets pulsed with the rhythm of produce that came from his soil. For decades, Rugov had been quietly acquiring lands others abandoned. To the careless eye, they were wastelands, cracked earth, dry hills, salt-stained flats. But to Rugov, they were promises waiting to be fulfilled. Where others saw loss, he saw potential. Where others gave up, he sowed hope. At first it was small, a few acres, then dozens, then hundreds, slowly like a river carving through stone. Rugov's vision grew unstoppable. His land stretched across states, covering valleys, plains, and hills. His produce flowed not just into local markets, but across seas, feeding families in countries that had never even heard his name. His investments were equally shrewd. While others flaunted cars and gold watches, Rugov put his profits into schools, warehouses, transport lines, and technology that made farming efficient. He funded irrigation projects in villages where water was a dream. He built storage facilities so that no farmer would lose crops to rot. His name might not have appeared on magazine covers, but in the quiet books of commerce, his signature fed nations. Yet Rugov never changed his way of life. His house remained simple, a farmhouse with mud walls and wooden beams. His meals were the same: roti dal, vegetables from his own fields. His clothes were patched not because he couldn't afford better, but because he didn't care to impress those who measured worth in fabric. He still rose before dawn to walk barefoot through wet soil, still sat with farmers half his age teaching them the lessons of patience, resilience, and respect for the land. To him, wealth was never gold or silver. It was the rustle of crops in the wind, the laughter of children in schools he funded, the gratitude of mothers who no longer walked miles for water. And so, while the world of executives and managers laughed at his appearance, Rugov's wealth quietly grew until it surpassed even theirs. By the time he was mocked in that hangar, he was no longer just a successful farmer. He was one of the richest men in the country. His empire was vast enough to rival industries, yet he remained the same humble soul who once sold vegetables barefoot in village markets. If they had looked closer, they might have seen the truth. The calluses on his hands were not signs of poverty, but of power earned honestly. The wrinkles on his face were not weakness, but marks of battles fought and won. The leather bag slung over his shoulder was not empty. It carried documents, contracts, and deeds that represented fortunes beyond their imaginations. But arrogance blinds. The executives around him saw only a poor old farmer. Their laughter grew louder, their words sharper. They mocked what they could never understand. Yet destiny has a way of stripping arrogance bare. For while they laughed at Rugov's hat and shirt, the hangar itself carried a secret, a truth that was about to crush their pride. The very jet gleaming behind them, the pride of the facility polished and waiting, was his. Its engines hummed quietly, prepared to carry its rightful owner across the skies. And Rugov knew it. Still, he did not reveal it. He did not need to. His life had taught him that truth blooms in its own time, just as crops emerge after patient seasons. He stood silently, enduring their mockery, knowing that in moments their laughter would choke into silence. For the richest man in the country stood among them, disguised in simplicity, and they had no idea. The laughter in the hangar had reached its peak. Diffier Malhotra smirked with the arrogance of a man who thought he had delivered the final blow. His words still echoed in the air. "This is a private facility. You don't belong here." Around him, executives chuckled. Staff members hid their giggles behind polished hands, and even a few pilots smirked from a distance. The old farmer stood silently in the middle of them all. His bent straw hat shadowed his eyes, but his face betrayed no anger. His chest rose and fell with calm breaths. His shoulders relaxed as though he had all the time in the world. That very calmness unsettled some, but their pride was too strong to admit it. To them, silence was weakness. To Rughav Sharma, silence was strength. And then, the rhythm of the hangar shifted. From the far side, footsteps echoed. Strong, purposeful, carrying authority that immediately changed the air. The laughter softened. Heads turned. The airport director had arrived, flanked by two assistants, his polished shoes striking the floor with precision. His eyes swept across the scene, instantly catching the unusual crowd gathered around the old farmer. But what followed was not what the executives expected. The director's stern expression melted into respect the moment his eyes fell upon Rughav. His steps quickened, his assistants rushing to keep up. He bypassed the suits, ignored the managers, and came straight to the man in the tattered shirt and frayed trousers. "Mr. Sharma," he said warmly, his voice carrying across the hangar. "Your jet is ready. The pilots are waiting for your instructions. Would you like us to arrange refreshments before your flight?" The hangar froze. The words struck harder than thunder. The laughter died mid-breath. The smirks fell from lips as though they had been slapped away. Silence spread like fire, burning through every corner, every whisper. Diffier Malhotra's confident smile cracked. His jaw slackened, his finger still pointing at Rughav, now trembling slightly as though it no longer knew where to land. His face drained of color, beads of sweat gathering at his temple. The insult he had so proudly thrown seconds ago now hung in the air like a noose tightening around his pride. Around him, the executives exchanged wide-eyed glances. The women in uniform gasped quietly, their polished composure shattered. The pilots straightened in shock, realizing the man they had mocked was not a lost farmer but the very owner of the shining jet behind them. Rughav lifted his gaze slowly. His eyes met the director's, calm and steady. He gave a small nod, nothing more. No flourish, no arrogance, just a humble acknowledgement of respect. And then he moved. With slow, steady steps, Rughav walked past the stunned crowd. No words left his lips. No rebuke, no retaliation, no mocking laughter thrown back at those who had ridiculed him moments ago. His silence cut deeper than any insult could. For in that silence lay the truth, that he did not need to prove his worth to anyone. His life, his empire, his legacy spoke louder than their shallow pride ever could. As he passed Diffier, the manager instinctively stepped aside, his body shrinking back as though the weight of his own arrogance pressed down upon him. For the first time in years, Diffier Malhotra had no words. The sharp tongue that had humiliated countless people failed him entirely. The hangar watched in awe as Rughav approached the stairs of his jet. Each step he took seemed heavier with dignity. Each movement a lesson that burned into the minds of everyone present. Never judge a man by his clothes. Never mistake humility for weakness. The engines of the jet hummed to life, their power filling the silence. Rughav paused at the foot of the stairs and turned his gaze once more across the hangar. His eyes swept the room, meeting the stares of men and women who moments ago had laughed at him. But there was no anger in his expression, only patience. The patience of a man who had endured far worse than their shallow ridicule. He climbed the stairs, slow but steady, his back straight, his head held high. The door of the jet opened, the polished interior glowing like a beacon of truth. As he stepped inside, whispers erupted among the crowd. "Mr. Sharma, the farmer. He owns this jet? He's the richest man in the country? How could we not have known?" The murmurs swirled, but none dared to speak too loudly. Their pride had been shattered, their arrogance exposed. The man they had dismissed as a beggar had just left them speechless with nothing but his presence. Inside the jet, Rughav settled into his seat by the window. The hum of the engines grew louder, preparing for takeoff. He gazed out at the runway, his thoughts drifting back through decades of struggle. He remembered the days when he had walked barefoot to the market, carrying sacks of grain on his shoulders. He remembered the ridicule of bankers who mocked his torn clothes while rejecting his loans. He remembered the nights when he nearly gave up, when his children slept hungry, when neighbors laughed at his dreams. And now, here he sat, not in triumph, but in gratitude. For he knew his wealth was not measured in jets or lands, but in the strength that carried him through, in the kindness that he never abandoned, in the humility that kept him grounded. The jet began to roll forward, its power building, its wings ready to lift. Rugov closed his eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer. Not for riches, not for revenge, not even for respect, but for the strength to remain the same man he had always been. A farmer at heart, a giver by nature, a soul unshaken by mockery. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, those left in the hangar stood in silence. Diffeer Malhotra clenched his fists, his pride in tatters. The executives bowed their heads, ashamed of their laughter. And deep within each of them, a lesson etched itself forever. Appearances deceive, but character reveals. The richest man in the country had walked among them dressed as a farmer. And without uttering a single word, he had taught them more than their entire lives of privilege ever had. The jet sliced through the clouds, climbing higher and higher until the world below shrank into dots and lines. Inside, Rugov Sharma sat quietly by the window. His weathered hands rested on the armrest, the faint tremor of age visible, but his eyes carried the strength of entire seasons. The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that feels sacred. For the first time since stepping into the hangar, Rugov allowed himself a long breath, his chest rising with the air of freedom. Yet behind that calm exterior, his mind was alive, walking back through the moments that had just unfolded. He thought of the laughter, sharp and cruel, like knives cutting through dignity. He thought of the pointed fingers, the whispers, the mockery. But instead of bitterness, a strange gratitude filled his heart. They reminded me, he thought, that the world still judges worth by cloth, not by character. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass window, wrinkles carved by years under the sun, skin darkened by labor, clothes that looked too plain for a seat worth millions. He studied himself as though asking silently, "Am I less because I look less?" The answer rose from within like a steady flame. No. My worth was never in what I wore, but in what I built, in what I gave, in what I endured. He remembered his youth, barefoot in the mud, carrying water from the well at dawn, working fields that refused to yield without sweat. Villagers had mocked him then too. Dreamer, they called him when he spoke of owning land beyond the horizon. Bankers had laughed when he entered their glass offices with calloused hands asking for loans. Traders had sneered when he stood in torn dhotis negotiating grain prices. The world had always mistaken his simplicity for weakness. Yet here he was. Not because he silenced them with words, but because he silenced himself and let his actions speak. He leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the hum of the jet cradle his thoughts. Wealth, he whispered softly to himself, was never meant to decorate the body. It was meant to strengthen the soul. On the ground, those executives and managers still stood frozen in the hangar. Some were already whispering among themselves, shame burning their faces. Rugov knew this. He had seen it before. Those who mock the humble often choke on regret when truth unfolds. But he did not rejoice in their humiliation. He pitied them, for their blindness was their curse, and his silence was his mercy. He thought of Diffeer Malhotra, the man who had stood in front of him with arrogance dripping from every word. Rugov could still see the fear flash in his eyes when the director called him Mr. Sharma. But Rugov felt no desire for revenge. Instead, he hoped the lesson would plant itself deep in Diffeer's heart, growing like a seed, painful at first, but blooming into wisdom with time. Because Rugov knew something few understood. The measure of a man is not in how he responds when respected, but in how he endures when mocked. Anyone can smile when praised, but to remain silent when ridiculed, that is strength. The jet's cabin lights dimmed slightly as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with strokes of orange and crimson. Rugov's thoughts grew softer, more reflective. He thought of his children, who had once asked him why he never dressed like the rich men they saw in the city. He had told them, "Clothes fade, but character stays. If they laugh at your shirt, let them. One day they will wish they had your soul." And now his life itself had just proven that lesson before a hall full of strangers. Meanwhile, back in the hangar, Silence still hung heavy. The executives replayed the scene over and over in their minds, their laughter, their jokes, their arrogance, contrasted with the airport director's respect, with the truth that shattered everything they thought they knew. Some shifted uncomfortably, ashamed. Others avoided each other's eyes, unable to face the mirror of their own cruelty, but none would forget. And that was Rugov's victory. Not the jet, not the wealth, not the titles, but the lesson carved into their hearts. He had not needed to scold, not needed to fight. His presence had been enough. As the jet steadied above the clouds, Rugov opened his eyes once more, gazing at the endless horizon. A soft smile touched his lips. In the end, he thought, the soil never forgets the seed, no matter how small. And neither will people forget the man they mocked when truth revealed who he really was. The engines hummed like a lullaby, steady and strong, carrying him toward his next destination. But for those left behind, the real journey had just begun. A journey of reflection, of regret, of questioning the illusions they had worshipped. Because from this day on, whenever they mocked another for their simple clothes, a single thought would stop them cold. What if he too is another Rugov Sharma? And that thought alone was enough to change them forever. The jet soared across the crimson horizon, fading into the distance like a symbol of quiet triumph. But down on the ground in the silence of that hangar, a truth lingered heavier than steel. Dozens of people, executives in their best suits, attendants in polished uniforms, and managers who thought they owned the world, were left standing with their pride shattered. They had mocked a man because of his clothes. They had laughed because of his appearance. They had judged because of what they could see, and yet, in one moment, that illusion collapsed. The farmer they ridiculed was not just wealthy, he was the richest man in the country. The memory of their laughter burned like fire in their throats. They had turned another human into entertainment, not knowing that the very jet they admired, the very land they depended on for food, the very economy that fueled their comfort, was sustained by this humble man they had disrespected. For Rugov Sharma, the lesson was simple. But for them it was unforgettable, because in that hangar, something larger than money was revealed. True wealth is invisible until character makes it visible. And this is where you, the listener, come in. How many times in your own life have you looked at someone and judged them by their clothes, their shoes, their home, their car? How many times have you dismissed someone because they didn't look successful enough? And how many times could you have been wrong? Think about it. Behind every wrinkled shirt could be a story of survival. Behind every dusty sandal could be miles walked in sacrifice. Behind every tired face could be wisdom deeper than books can teach. We live in a world obsessed with appearances. People wear brands not to stay warm but to feel worthy. They chase cars not to travel but to be seen. They measure success in watches and wallets. Yet when life tests us, none of these things matter. What remains is who we are, the soil of our character, the kindness we plant, and the humility we carry. Rugov's story is not just about one man who shocked a group of executives. It is about every single one of us. It's a reminder that the person you ignore today could be the very hand that saves you tomorrow. The stranger you laugh at could be the teacher you never expected. The man you mock could be the man who feeds your family. So ask yourself, next time you see someone in torn clothes, will you laugh or will you wonder about their story? Next time you see someone simple, will you dismiss them or will you respect the soul behind the face? And most importantly, what kind of person do you want to be? The one who mocks or the one who remembers that every human carries dignity? The answer lies in your heart. Rugov chose humility over pride, patience over anger, silence over revenge, and that is why he won, not just in wealth but in legacy. If this story touched you, if it made you pause and reflect, then share it. Let others be reminded too. Leave a comment. What did you feel when the truth about Rugov was revealed? Because sometimes the greatest change begins not with money or power, but with a single moment of reflection. And as you move forward in your life, remember this: never judge a person by their clothes, for within them may rest the richest soul you'll ever meet.